I first learned how a life ends by counting the seconds it takes for a room to forget a person. The ballroom at the Halcyon Rose Hotel forgot Victor Halden in 16. He collapsed between a marble column and a silent quartet, one hand reaching for the tuxedo jacket pocket where he always kept his EpiPen, and I watched the circle around him expand and hiccup and settle. By second 6, someone shouted for a medic. By second 10, the maitre d' pulled down the lights. By second 16, the first whisper found my ear. It didn't fire. That sentence lived under my skin as paramedics lifted Chicago's most tireless dealmaker from a gold-flecked floor and pushed him toward a service elevator, his face already losing shape. I knew Victor's allergy, shellfish, strictly avoided, meticulously managed. I knew his habits, redundant pens, glove box spares, a travel case tucked in every brief. I knew because I had been hired to know. 2 weeks earlier, he'd retained me to run a discreet audit on his company's sloppier corners and to draft language for a new will that installed a stewardship clause I didn't like and he wouldn't drop. But that night, I was just a guest at a fundraising gala, a forensic accountant in a rented tux, and the executor of a will that had the ink barely dry. The hall reassembled itself as if nothing had happened. The quartet resumed, softer. The oysters were replaced by steak tartare, as if the shellfish themselves had staged a mutiny. I slipped into a service corridor and stared at my hands until they stopped shaking. I can read numbers until they confess. I can hold a ledger like a throat. But a man who plans for every contingency and dies of the one he rehearsed to death, that's not math. That's intention, or negligence, or a motive that thinks it's smarter than grief. By midnight, the widow's eyes were dry, the son was on the phone in a stairwell, and the daughter was already furious at a world that looked too clean. I walked out into a night that fogged and glittered around the river and promised myself I would open the safe tomorrow and prove to the paper what the room refused to say out loud. Someone wanted Victor's EpiPen to fail.
My name is Nathan Cole, 37, Chicago, Illinois. I grew up in a one-bedroom walk-up on Damon with a mother who worked morning shifts at a diner and nights as a temp in office buildings where rich men's trash needed translating. She called me her human calculator. I called her the gravity that never complained. She died when I was 22, a quiet aneurysm on a bus, and I learned then how quickly a city recycles sorrow. I stayed put. I built a small practice from the bones of other people's mistakes. My niche? Follow the mess where it hides. My rule? Never believe what a balance sheet claims it feels. I met Victor 2 years ago at a breakfast for a logistics trade group. He asked me for an opinion on a competitor's creative accounting, and I gave him the plain kind. He liked that I didn't decorate it. He began to send me quiet work, subsidiaries to straighten, premium audits to challenge, a charity whose endowment leaked in polite drips. He didn't trust easily. People who get rich by inventing air routes over land rarely do. But he trusted the way I told him bad news. Somewhere in there, he decided he wanted me near when he eventually left the room. His family was a constellation with its own gravity. Evelyn, the widow, 34, a gallery owner whose elegance made people pretend they couldn't count. She had married Victor late. A prenup kept her from being a cliché, or so the papers said. Marcus, the 42-year-old son from Victor's first marriage, worked as COO and carried the permanent tension of someone whose father never stopped being the metric. Leela, the 29-year-old daughter, a public policy activist who described the family business as industrial harm in a bespoke suit, a phrase that made Victor laugh until he didn't. Victor's sister Helene kept Sunday dinners like a religion and watched everything as if she'd personally invented caution. There were also the orbitals, Nora Chen, CFO, who prided herself on delivering no surprises, Arthur Pike, Victor's boyhood friend and business partner who managed the Old Line real estate portfolio, and a committee of lawyers, none of whom liked my tendency to translate their Latin into liability. 3 days before he died, Victor called me into his office on the 32nd floor and showed me a document that wasn't a will yet, but wanted to be. It split an empire not by blood, not by primogeniture, but by a measurement he called stewardship. Assets shall be held in trust for 30 days. Distribution contingent upon conduct evidencing fitness, truthfulness, and loyalty to the whole. The executor, me, would have sole discretion to decide what that meant. I told him it was a grenade with my name on it. He told me people behave differently when they think someone is watching. So watch, he said. And he tapped the breast pocket of his suit where he kept his EpiPen and added, almost as a joke, "And make sure I keep breathing long enough to sign this." He signed. He died. And I was left with a city that doesn't forgive vagueness and a family in which every single member now had a reason for their grief to look like strategy. The past has a way of composing alibis before you need them. I didn't know then that mine had already been written. I just knew that 30 days is a short time to decide who deserves anything. It felt shorter when I opened Victor's safe and found the sealed codicil he'd told me to open only after I wrote what he called a truthful account. I didn't know then that the truthful account was mine. I only knew that the EpiPen case from the gala had been quietly returned to the office by building security, and the injector inside was a trainer, harmless, hollow, a toy with a blue cap. Someone, somewhere, had replaced his lifeline with a rehearsal. I shut the safe, I locked the office, and I began to watch.
Victor's funeral pulled the city into a corridor of black coats and cameras. The service, at a modernist church in River North, tried to balance the math of a life. How many jobs created, how many deliveries made on time, against the untidier sum of a man's private calculations. I watched the heirs like I was reading footnotes. Evelyn accepted condolences with a stillness she wore like a tailored dress. She was composed, maybe too composed, but grief manifests in the architecture it can afford. Marcus shook hands the way a CEO signals continuity. The machine runs. The machine is me. Leela looked like someone who'd been told a story too many times and finally stopped believing it. Helene nodded to anyone who approached with casseroles and warnings. Arthur hovered at the edges, a half step behind the family, but never lost in the crowd. Nora stood with the executives and didn't look at the casket once. After the service, I collected the family in Victor's study at the townhouse on Astor Street to read the will. The room was books and leather, and an enormous model of a cargo ship that Victor had once used to explain economies of scale to me with a schoolboy's glee. I read the formalities. I read the stewardship clause that made 3 of the 4 immediate faces go brackish. I read the part about my discretion and felt the temperature change. When I finished, I placed the sealed codicil on the desk and reminded them it stayed closed for 30 days while the trust held everything in its quiet hands. Evelyn asked the only question that mattered. What exactly are you watching for? I told her the truth, where it normally hides. Marcus asked if daily operations continued. I said yes. Leela asked, what happens if no one proves worthy? I said that was not a contingency the will allowed, and I tried not to imagine the courtroom it would breed. Helene asked if the townhouse continued to be the family home. I told her yes, for now, and she nodded as if she'd heard a prayer answered. I did not tell them about the trainer EpiPen. Not yet. What I did tell them was that I would be at the office the next morning at 7, going through Victor's personal files and the security footage from the gala, and that I would be asking each of them for a conversation, alone, in a room where grief could drop its pretense. The room emptied in strata. Evelyn was last to leave. On the way out, she touched the back of Victor's chair the way you touch a door frame when you don't want to admit you're steadying yourself. He said you were honest, she said. Be honest with me. Did someone help him die? I told her the only honest thing I had. If someone did, I said, they believed he deserved it, or they believed they did. She exhaled as if she'd expected me to say the part I didn't. Every single one of you has a motive.
The office at Halden Logistics was a skyline and glass. I sat in Victor's chair, powered on his computer, and opened a folder named for a month that hadn't begun yet. He had set up a private archive for me, NC in case, and the first file was a single page of bullet points, each a sentence fragment, each a breadcrumb that tasted like someone else's paranoia. E. Prenup anniversary, 5-year clause. Gallery loan from NC flagged in accounts? Ask Nora. M. Margin calls, off-book swaps? Check with Pike. L. New nonprofit filed 501c3. Donors include Union Pension Fund. Y. Nora. Comp structure, deferred bonuses. See side letter. AP. Redevelopment parcels. Shadow LLC. Helene. Guardianship of ancestral farmland. Deed anomalies. He'd also saved 2 short video clips from the gala, one of a server delivering canapés to the head table, and another of Victor patting his jacket pocket, smiling at Evelyn as if to say, "I'm prepared." It looked like a habit. It looked like a man reassuring himself his talisman was where it should be. Security sent up a small cardboard box containing the EpiPen case and the pen inside. White plastic, blue cap, orange tip. I knew the trainers because I'd used one on my mother as a teenager, not out of necessity, but out of practice. She wasn't allergic to anything. She wanted me to know what to do if life took a turn. The trainer clicks when the blue cap comes off. It doesn't deliver adrenaline. It delivers a lesson. The difference between motion and effect. I pop the cap. Click. The hollow sound of a promise designed not to keep itself. I logged the chain of custody, placed the pen in a lockbox, and started the conversations. I kept them short. I let silence do what it always does when numbers fail. Force the person in the chair across from me to fill it. Evelyn arrived first, in a navy dress that made her look more like a trustee than a widow. She said she'd stepped out to the restroom minutes before Victor collapsed. She said he hadn't touched the oysters. She said the prenup didn't scare her, because 5 years felt like a detail invented by men who wanted control over time. She did not mention the gallery loan. I didn't ask. Not yet. Marcus arrived with a notebook, as if the meeting were a quarterly review. He wanted to talk about contracts and continuity, and the fact that the bank had sent a letter Victor ignored. He did not mention margin calls. He did not ask me how I planned to interpret stewardship. He looked at the box on my desk and didn't ask what was inside. Leela didn't sit. She paced. She asked how it felt to suddenly hold the family by the throat, and if I enjoyed it. She asked whether the trust could be assigned to fund her nonprofit's eviction defense project, and whether she could campaign publicly against the company while technically waiting for an inheritance from it. She did not mention the pension fund donation that made her new organization look less radical and more strategic. Nora came in with numbers. She had prepared a packet. Cash positions, receivables, a memo about interest rate exposure that read like a bedtime story for anxious CFOs. She said, "There will be no surprises." I thought, that is a sentence surprises love to hear. Arthur arrived last and sat as if he were in his family doctor's office. He said he'd known Victor since they were 8, and that sometimes the truth about a man is that he cannot be known all the way through. He said grief loosens bolts that were already loose. He said nothing that moved the dial except for a question he let fall like a coin. Do you believe the will made him a target? I told him I believe the will made everyone look at themselves. He nodded, and in that nod I thought I saw relief, and then the flicker of a man rehearsing how to explain the existence of a Shadow LLC. By 5, the river had turned the color of pennies. I stood and watched the office take its nighttime shape. I made a list, the kind my mother used to draw on diner order pads. What each person needs, wants, fears. I wrote one more line beneath them all. What do I want? The pen hesitated. The truthful answer is not the noble one. The truthful answer is this. I wanted a history I had spent my whole life guessing at to stand up and say it knew my name. I slid that thought back into the unlit part of myself and circled a different truth. I wanted the codicil to open and not break me. At midnight, I'd watched them all. By morning, I had my first crack.
The crack came disguised as a kindness. A courier delivered flowers to the office for Evelyn with a note from a lender in River West. The amount written on the invoice attached was too neat for grief: $450,000. A gallery bridge loan due in 30 days, interest accelerating if the estate challenged any attached guarantees. The guarantor named on page 2 was not Evelyn. It was Halden Logistics Holdings, LLC, authorized by N. Chen, CFO. I walked the block to the gallery. It smelled like plaster and new paint. Evelyn stood in front of a series of steel photographs that looked like the city had finally confessed it wanted to be a cathedral. I showed her the loan. She didn't flinch. She said Victor had agreed to backstop a renovation after a water main broke, and insurance slow-walked the claim. She said Nora had arranged it. She hadn't asked for that. She hadn't wanted a favor to turn into a caller. She asked if the stewardship clause meant the trust could pull the guarantee. I told her it meant everything was under an eye now. She nodded like someone who already lives in a gallery of eyes. Back at the office, my inbox delivered a notice of default addressed to Marcus personally. $2 million due on a line against a stock portfolio whose value had eroded in the last quarter's interest rate whiplash. He had transferred a pledged block of Halden shares to cover a derivative bet a week before Victor died. The transfer would have required a countersignature. The signature on the form looked like Victor's hand, but the pressure was wrong. If it was genuine, Victor had reluctantly bailed his son out. If it was not, then motive grew teeth. And Lila. That afternoon, a clip went viral. Lila on the courthouse steps at a rally against a proposed freight hub, calling Halden Logistics a polite bulldozer. She hadn't posted it. Someone else had. She texted me before I could text her. They'll say this disqualifies me. Let them. Truth is a clause you either live or litigate. Her nonprofit's early donors, pension funds from municipal unions, posted in support. The optics were precarious. If she was making herself the public enemy of the company whose inheritance she awaited, what story did she want the trust to tell about conflict and conviction? By evening, the board requested an emergency meeting. Arthur chaired, Nora presented risk. The bankers dialed in like weather. I sat at the head, the executor with a box I hadn't opened and a power I didn't want. But stewardship doesn't negotiate with nerves. It keeps time like a metronome and watches the hands around the table try to fake the rhythm. Halfway through the agenda, an email slipped across my screen from a source at building security who owed me a favor. A week before the gala, someone had requested access to Victor's office at night. The card used belonged to a temp custodian. The footage showed a person in a baseball cap and mask entering after midnight and leaving 4 minutes later. The EpiPen case sat plainly on Victor's desk in that footage. 4 minutes isn't long enough to search a suite. It's long enough to swap one thing for another. It's long enough to decide that breath is a resource that can be rationed. I asked security for a still image. They sent it. The posture was familiar, in the way posture reveals someone who's been measured his whole life and always finds himself an inch short. I stared until my eyes invented faces. The more I looked, the more I saw Marcus's shoulders. The thinner I felt the line between inference and accusation become. I closed my laptop where the board couldn't see my screen. I asked Nora to walk me through the company's risk exposures again. When she finished, she said it. There will be no surprises. I smiled the way you smile when you know the surprise has already entered the building. My clock said I had 25 days left to distribute an empire. My gut said the wrong kind of surprise takes only one.
The codicil stayed sealed. I told myself I would not open it until the end. I meant it. I also kept staring at it like a man stares at a door he already knows what's behind. I took the train to Humboldt Park on a Sunday and walked past my old building to a laundromat that wasn't a laundromat anymore. The woman who owns the cafe there now knew my mother. She remembered her handwriting on an order pad. She remembered that in the late 80s, my mother worked nights at an office on Wacker where a small logistics company tried to pretend it was a big one. She remembered a man who used to wait at the bus stop and talk to my mother like they were both bored by the same horizon. She remembered his name because it got big. He wasn't big then, she said, just a man who carried a pen like it mattered. I asked if she thought my mother had loved him. She shrugged,
and said some people get more oxygen from being seen than from breathing, and sometimes those people leave before they can suffocate the room. I walked for hours in a grid that felt composed for me. I ended at the river and watched the shallow water pretend it was deep. I went home and opened the box where I keep the few items of my mother's that the city didn't lose. At the bottom, under old bus passes and a gold watch that won't wind anymore, was a photograph I had never really looked at with courage. My mother in a break room, a man leaning against a vending machine, his face half turned like a refusal. It was Victor, before he learned to square his shoulders into a logo. I didn't need a test to understand the implication. I didn't need the codicil to tell me I might be more than the executor of this estate. I might be the reason Victor never trusted the clean version of any story. I might be a son he didn't claim because claiming is a form of failure if you've built a life on the idea that you own no one except the future. I slept poorly for the first time in years. In the morning, I made coffee strong enough to erase the tremor in my hands. Then I wrote my mother a letter I would never send. I know, I wrote, and whether he is mine doesn't change the math of who I am, but it changes the math of motive. And I am the one holding the ledger. I folded the letter and slid it under the codicil like a truce. The next knock on my door was not a surprise. It was Marcus, in a suit that fit like armor, holding a question he wanted to look like a complaint. "Are you trying to ruin us, or simply pick the winner?" he asked. "I'm trying to find the truth," I said. "Truth is a performance," he said. "You're the audience who believes he's not part of the show." He left before I could ask him why he'd been in his father's office at midnight the week before the gala. Maybe I wanted him to force the question to break out of me. Maybe I wanted him to confess to the trainer in my lockbox. Maybe I wanted him to be guiltier than I was for wanting to belong. That night a message arrived from my security contact. We pulled the card logs from that week. The custodial badge used belonged to a temp agency. But the badge was cloned. Whoever used it knew enough to mask their own. He attached a clearer still. The person in the cap held their shoulders in a way that still looked like Marcus and someone who had learned to imitate him. The midpoint of any story is not an event. It's when the story takes your jaw in its hand and insists you stop pretending this is about the ledger. It's about blood that never signed a contract and breath that failed on the one night it could not afford ceremony. The night after that revelation, a rock shattered the front window of Leela's nonprofit. A note attached, "Keep your hands off what feeds you." The police called it vandalism. I called it a warning from someone who wanted the trust to remain obedient to money. The 30-day clock ticked down, a notch louder.
I have a habit when I'm cornered. I walk to the freight yards. The geometry calms me. Tracks like parallel arguments, boxcars like secrets that agreed to be hauled. I walked there the next morning and watched men in orange vests choreograph containers. Victor used to watch here too, he'd told me, when he needed to remember that efficiency is just mercy sped up. Standing there, I realized I'd been letting the family carry too much of my suspicion, simply because they fit the story. Every heir has a motive, is a narrative that collects its own proof. But money teaches a different lesson. When a story feels perfect, check the ledger for the thing it's hiding. I went back to the office and asked Nora for the side letter to her compensation package, the one Victor's notes had flagged. She produced it like a dentist produces an X-ray, apologetic, confident it would prove her point. The letter tied a discreet bonus to the closing of a redevelopment deal on the south side. Parcels bundled quietly through an LLC that did not include Arthur's name, but used his attorney. The bonus would double if the deal closed without regulatory delay. Lila's public protest and the city council hearing her nonprofit had forced were a delay. If Victor died and the trust needed smooth cash, the incentive to push that deal through now grew fangs. I asked Nora who structured the side letter. "Victor," she said. "He wanted to reward speed." I asked who kept the EpiPens in his office stocked. "His assistant," she said, "but I've seen him check them himself." I asked whether she had ever seen a trainer EpiPen in the building. She paused. "We filmed a workplace safety video last month. Prop department ordered trainers for the set." She smiled, proud of a culturally responsible corporate effort. We returned them to the producer afterward.
I asked for the producer's name. I called him. He was in Pilsen, filming a warehouse compliance walkthrough. He checked his inventory log. A single trainer remained unaccounted for. He assumed someone had tossed it. He emailed me a photo of the set trainers. The one in my lockbox could have been its sibling. I asked security for a list of everyone who had badge access to the set the day of filming. The list included Nora. The footage showed her holding a trainer, laughing, while an HR manager demonstrated how to hold the pen and count. I do not know how to explain what jealousy looks like when it's aimed at competence, but I felt a version of it myself. Nora was the sort of person who implemented safety trainings on time. She was the sort of person who never missed a detail, unless the detail served a narrative she had chosen to believe about herself. That afternoon, I visited Arthur. His office smelled like old wood and second chances. I asked him about the Shadow LLC. He sighed. He said he'd set it up years ago to land bank parcels in neighborhoods that were getting ready to flip without driving prices up with the Halden name. He said Victor had blessed it, but the profits would roll back into the family. I asked if he had profited personally. He said yes, within reason. He said no one gets to pretend virtue is free. He also said he had no interest in widening the circle of suspects when the obvious ones were in-house. Then he said a quieter thing. Victor told me he'd made a provision in the will that would force everyone to show themselves. He didn't tell me, it made you the mirror. That night, I went home and took the lockbox out of the closet. I placed the trainer pen on my kitchen table and stared at it the way you stare at an instrument you learned but never loved. Nora's mantra kept echoing, there will be no surprises. If she believed she could orchestrate a reality where risk was contained, maybe she had made herself blind to the difference between rehearsing harm and making it possible. The motive would be tidy. Her bonus, the deal, the trust that needed liquidity, the widow's loan that could be called due, the board's unease that preferred certainty over scandal. And yet, the story still made too much sense. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink. The next morning, a new detail arrived that broke the symmetry in a way that felt like a confession wearing someone else's coat.
Security triangulated the gait of the masked person from the midnight footage with parking garage entry logs. The car used a monthly pass registered to Helene Ward. The timestamp placed the car entering at 11:54 p.m., leaving at 12:12 a.m. She had visited her brother's office at midnight the week before his death, stayed exactly the amount of time it takes to make a simple swap, and left without tripping a keycard in the elevators. The garage camera showed a second person exiting the passenger side when the car left. That person's shoulders again read like Marcus's, but the coat was not his. The mask made certainty an act of will, not comprehension. I visited Helene under the pretense of delivering estate documents. Her house smelled like clean pine in years that insisted on being counted in Sunday dinners. The ancestral farmland she'd been stewarding sat in a set of framed photos along the hallway. Illinois dirt that looked like a promise, then a curse, then a promise again. I asked her if she had been to the office that night. She said yes, out of habit. She often dropped off her brother's favorite bakery cookies when he worked late. He ate like a teenager when he was stressed, she said. Sugar calmed him. He pretended it didn't. I asked if Marcus had been with her. She said no, then yes, then he walked me to my car. She asked if there was a problem. I looked at the photo of their childhood farmhouse and asked if the deed had any anomalies. She straightened. You sound like your mother, she said. I asked what she meant. She said, you remember everything and make it sound like the truth is the only luxury we can afford. She didn't deny the garage timestamp. She didn't admit anything that mattered. She did put a box of cookies in my hands on my way out, as if sugar could be a truce. From Helene's, I went to Evelyn's gallery again. The front window had a crack in it now that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. She said a delivery truck had misjudged the curb. She said she didn't want to bother the insurance company again. She said she had looked into the prenup anniversary clause and found that it ticked over in 11 days, which meant under one reading that her rights under the will changed if the marriage had lasted exactly 5 years. Victor had died at 4 years and 51 weeks. Was a week enough motive for a person who said time is a detail invented by men? It would be easy to say yes. It would be lazy to stop there. And the farm?
In the property records, the deed had been transferred twice in the last decade, once to a family LLC, once back to Helene. A cross-reference with a campaign finance database showed that twice, a developer had pledged to reroute a county road near it and then rescinded the plan. Each time an LLC that shared a mailing address with Arthur's law firm had appeared on the periphery of the transaction. Every line I followed to the past braided into the present like a rope offered from two directions at once. Motives multiplied. Proof refused to sit down. I ended the day with a bad habit. I returned to the freight yards and counted the seconds it took for a man to move a container from one column to another and pretend the inventory stayed the same. The city breathed in steel. I tried to match it. My phone vibrated with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "You're looking at the wrong night." Then a second. "Check the rehearsal footage." I thought of Nora's safety video and the trainers. I thought of the word rehearsal like a dare. The truth doesn't hide where you shine the light. It hides where you don't bother to look because you think the show is over.
The HR manager sent me the rehearsal footage for the safety video. The timestamp was 2 days before the gala. The conference room looked like any. A whiteboard with cheerful bullets, a tray of sandwiches nobody ate. The prop EpiPens sat in a neat row, capped and benign. The HR manager demonstrated against a foam pad. People laughed at themselves as they tried to hold their thumb not over the orange tip. "Blue to the sky," the manager said, "orange to the thigh." The camera panned briefly to the door as it opened. Marcus stood there in shirt sleeves, grinning, as if expenses had finally bought him a joke. He stepped in, grabbed a trainer, and clicked it like a nervous tick. The blue cap landed on the carpet. He picked it up, set the pen down among the others, and left without a word. The camera did not follow. Nora clapped at a different joke. I called Marcus. He said he'd stopped in to make fun of the training. He said he'd left to take a call. He said he didn't remember where he set the trainer down. I asked if he had been at the office at midnight with his aunt. He said parking garages are public spaces, and grief makes people do ritualistic things at strange hours. He said I was building a case. He said he understood. He said he hoped I built it well enough to survive the moment it turned around and asked me why I cared so much. I sat at my kitchen table again, with the trainer pen and the still image of the midnight visitor, and the knowledge that the difference between a trainer and the real thing is deliberate. It does not happen by accident. It requires a choice. If it's negligence, it is negligence of a kind that is indistinguishable from intention. If it's murder, it is a lazy one that trusts the victim to walk into the trap and pull the trigger for you. Victor had pulled his trigger and found only a click. It was a murder, if it was one, that outsourced its courage to a man's own panic. I looked at the codicil again. It was a white envelope that weighed more than rooms. I thought of my mother's letter beneath it. I opened a beer I didn't want and held it like a prop. The 30-day deadline split itself into hours and slid under the door. I set an alarm for 4 a.m. and tried to sleep. It didn't come. At 2, I typed the phrase Stewardship Clause Case Law Illinois into a legal database and confirmed what I already knew. Courts hated discretion when it wasn't framed like math. I was not building a case. I was building a story that would convince a judge that truth and fitness have kneecaps. At 4, the alarm went off. I showered and shaved and talked to myself in the mirror the way people do before they decide who they're going to be that day. I told myself I would stop pretending Nora's mantra was a lullaby. I would stop pretending Marcus's shoulders were proof. I would go to the warehouse where the safety video props had been stored, and I would find the missing trainer's paper trail. I would ask Evelyn the question I had been avoiding. Who benefits more from an early death? The woman who was 1 week short of an anniversary, or the company that needs a crisis to accelerate a deal? I would ask Helene for the truth about the midnight visit. I would ask Arthur if he had traded the family name for the kind of anonymity that makes motive look like prudence. And then I would open the codicil. That plan felt like courage until the text arrived at 6. Stop. Meet me at the river. Bring the pen. No name, just a location pin 2 blocks from the gallery. I walked there under a sky that couldn't decide if it meant rain. Leela stood under the bridge, hands jammed in the pockets of a thrifted coat that tried and failed to look like armor.
"You think I want the money," she said before I could speak. "I want the company to stop eating neighborhoods. You think that makes me noble. It makes me useful to someone who doesn't want to get their hands dirty." She pulled a small, dented case from her pocket and handed it to me. Inside was an actual EpiPen, real, labeled, not a trainer. "He gave it to me," she said, after the video day. "He said, blue to the sky, orange to the thigh, and the truth is never embarrassed by practice." He laughed. He told me to hold on to a spare because he didn't trust anyone to remember him when he couldn't breathe. I forgot to give it back. She closed her eyes, angry at herself for the human act of forgetting. I remembered the night of the gala, but I didn't go. I wanted him to learn something without me. I thought that would be my stewardship. Her mouth tightened. Now it looks like neglect. If you need to make me the villain, do it. I took the pen. It felt heavier than it should. I'm not assigning villains. I'm assigning facts. She looked at me with disgust that felt like respect wearing its coat inside out. Facts are villains when they decide the story. She walked away without waiting for an answer. The river watched and refused to explain itself. I had what I needed to write the truth as a knife. I wasn't sure I had what I needed to hold it.
With Lila's real pen in my pocket, I walked straight to Nora's office. I placed both pens on her desk, the trainer and the real one. "Tell me why these crossed paths," I said. She didn't feign confusion. She looked at them like a magician looks at a trick after someone explains it too slowly. "The props were returned," she said. "I signed off. If a trainer ended up in Victor's personal case, then someone ignored the checklist." "Who had the case last?" I asked. "Victor," she said. "He kept it on his desk the day of the shoot to show people he wasn't above training. He liked theater when it made him look practical." I asked for the checklist. She printed it. I traced the signatures. HR, Safety Officer, Nora. A single initial stood out. EH. I recognized it as Evelyn Holden. "She dropped in during the shoot," Nora said, seeing my eyes find the mark. "She brought coffee. She asked if the pens were real. I told her not to worry, we weren't stabbing anyone. She laughed. She initialed the catering invoice because Victor's assistant was out. She left." I walked to Evelyn's gallery a third time in as many days. The crack in the window had been patched. Evelyn stood in a shaft of morning light looking at a sculpture made of bent steel and glass that felt like a city learning to forgive itself for being heavy. I showed her the checklist. I asked about the initials. She said she'd signed for coffee. She said she'd never touched the pens. She said the world had a way of making women responsible for the props in men's plays. Then she turned the question. "Why do you care so much, Nathan?" she asked, almost gently. "You weren't family. You were paid to be precise. Now you're acting like you're avenging a father." My answer surprised me with how ready it was. Because precision is how I pray. And because I grew up with a question that made a shape in my life and I think he knew the answer. She tilted her head. "She did," she said. "He told me 6 months ago. He said, I hired the right man because he's mine and doesn't know it yet. He'll be hard on them because no one was easy on him. He said he would tell you. I suppose he ran out of breath." I stood very still in a gallery that suddenly felt smaller than honesty. I asked, "Did you love him?" She said, "I loved the version of him that wanted to be good. He wanted that version to win. He made a clause so someone else could measure it. Then he threw you into the room because he couldn't bear to grade his own test." On the way out, a delivery man handed me a legal envelope addressed to me at the office but routed here by mistake. Inside was a copy of an email from a bank. Nora had authorized a bridge facility secured by the Shadow LLC's parcels, contingent on the trust dissolving without litigation. The date was the morning after Victor died. Her mantra had broken its promise. There would be surprises. They all arrived at once. At the board meeting that afternoon, I told them I would be announcing distribution decisions in 72 hours, early, because the behaviors I had witnessed had already told me most of what I needed to know. I watched their faces calibrate. Fear invents math. Arthur asked whether the redevelopment deal would close. "Not if it eats the city," I said. Marcus asked whether the company would refinance the line. "Not if the collateral is forged," I said. Evelyn asked whether the gallery loan would be honored. "Not if it was used as a leash," I said. Lila asked whether her nonprofit's protest disqualified her. "Not if it was truth," I said. Nora asked whether her bonus would be paid. "Not if it bought silence," I said. I went home and opened the codicil. The letter inside was written in a hand that tried to be neat and failed at the edges. "Nathan," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am finished pretending that the future cares about my privacy. You are my son. Your mother let me be young when I wasn't. I made a choice that let me be rich instead of right. I am not asking you to forgive anything. I am asking you to do the thing I could not. Tell them the truth about the air they breathe. If I died because someone wanted me to, do not console yourself by deciding the villain is the person you least like. The villain is the person who believes the machine is more important than the people under it. If you cannot find a clean act, measure the intent, distribute accordingly. And if you can't breathe, tilt your head back and count to 10. It helps. V." I put the letter down and realized I had been holding my breath for years. I exhaled and let the room return. The next morning, I wrote my distribution memo like a surgeon writes discharge orders. Then I called a press conference. If stewardship meant anything, it meant daylight.
We met in the same modernist church where the funeral had been held. Cameras again. The city loves a performance when it believes the ending will punish someone it already suspects. I stood at the lectern and told a story that refused to be tidy. I began with the EpiPen trainer. I explained the prop shoot, the rehearsal, the missing trainer that found its way into Victor's personal case. I did not accuse someone of the midnight swap. I described the evidence. Cloned badge, Helene's car, a figure in a mask whose shoulders could be read like anger dressed up as inheritance. I said negligence masquerading as intention is still intention. I said we would let law enforcement continue their work. I made it clear that until a court pronounced a crime, we would treat the death as an accident engineered by complacency. Then I turned to stewardship. I said the clause had forced each heir to show themselves. I said Evelyn had accepted a loan backstopped by the company, but had neither hidden it nor used it to leverage the trust. She had asked whether the guarantee should be pulled when she understood its implications. I said she would receive a share designed to free her from men's details, the townhouse, and a fund to uncouple her gallery from company credit. I said Marcus had hidden personal debt and used his father's name as a lever against time. He had also kept the company running under pressure and protected payroll through a week when grief softened spines. He would receive less than he wanted, but more than punishment would give. A capped equity stake vesting over 5 years, contingent on independent oversight and full disclosure of any personal pledges. Stewardship for him would mean enduring accountability longer than ego likes to. I said Lila had chosen to tell the truth about the company in public, even when it endangered her own inheritance. She had also withheld a spare pen, a human lapse that had become a stone in her throat. She would receive a trust dedicated to the nonprofit's work with a binding condition. The company would submit all future redevelopment projects to an impact board chaired by someone not named Halden. In other words, if she wanted to fight, she would fight with a budget and the burden of proof. I said Helene had loved her brother enough to bring him cookies at midnight and perhaps to participate in a rehearsal she didn't understand. Her guardianship of the farm would end. The land would be placed in a conservation easement that protected it from speculative games. She would receive lifetime rights to the house that contained those Sunday sermons and a stipend that made her independent of anyone's foggy memories. I said Arthur had engineered a shadow structure that blurred loyalty with expedience. He would resign from boards that required sunlight and remain where his history mattered, chairing a philanthropy arm that converted the profits of past harm into something the city could tolerate. The parcels he had land banked would return to the family trust under an independent manager. I said Nora had betrayed the company not because she wanted to hurt it, but because she believed there were no surprises left if she kept the variables under her thumb. She had structured her bonus to reward speed over scrutiny and had moved to finance a deal in the first week of grief. She would be terminated for cause, bonuses rescinded, and referred to the authorities for the part she played in a culture that made the trainer swap plausible. Not because she was the villain, because stewardship cannot coexist with a mantra that refuses to be surprised by its own blind spots. Finally, I said this. Victor Halden named me executor because he mistook my precision for distance. He also wrote a letter that closed that distance. I am his son. I will not inherit more because of it. I will inherit a burden, which I choose. Then I took the box with the EpiPen trainer out from under the lectern and placed it beside the real pen Lila had given me. This is what killed him, and this is what could have saved him. Between them is a choice we make every day, to rehearse harm or to prepare for it honestly. From this day forward, the Halden estate will fund preparation that doesn't lie. Reporters shouted, cameras tried to eat the pens with their lenses. Marcus stared at me like I had upended a table he'd nailed to the floor. Evelyn closed her eyes as if a weather system had finally moved through. Lila cried once, silently, then stopped herself with her fist against her mouth like a promise. Helene sat down, suddenly old in a way that looked like relief. Arthur nodded the way men nod at final acts that feel fairer than they expected. After the conference, a detective shook my hand and said, "We'll be in touch about the midnight visit." He meant, "We will accept your narrative until the lab tells us whether it likes it." I nodded. The distribution would be challenged. Of course it would. Stories like mine offend people who believe inheritance is an accounting identity. But accounts close every day with entries messier than this. Stewardship is what you do after you total the column and decide the remainder is a person. When I returned to the office, the codicil lay where I'd left it, emptied. My mother's letter still waited beneath it, patient the way the dead are. I added one line. I told them. Then I went back to work. The trust doesn't care about catharsis. It cares about disbursements and time. The city outside my window breathed in steel and gave back a sigh that sounded like, just for a moment, mercy.
30 days after the funeral, the court stamped my distribution orders, the board reconstituted itself under the impact conditions, and the freight yard ran like it always had, indifferent and exacting. On my desk, the trainer and the real pen sat side by side in the shadow like a diagram. I held them one last time, felt the difference between the click that imitates salvation and the force that actually delivers it, and realized the inheritance Victor left wasn't wealth or blood. It was a rule I could finally say out loud and mean. In a city that forgets you in 16 seconds, you do the one thing that makes time stop. You tell the truth and live under it.